All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Feeling and Healing podcast. I am Danielle Z, MFT in the making, motivator, and mental health maven. And today I am so happy to welcome Jan and Jillian. They are relationship coaches, conflict resolution experts, and they work with entrepreneurs and executives to achieve fulfillment, establish healthy boundaries, and confidently go into the world with their values, which we were just talking about. So welcome, Jan and Jillian. Thank you for coming.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks
thanks
for
for
having
having
us.
us.
Of course. So I know you guys are like the boundary babes, like I could call you. And as a person who is learning a lot about boundaries and as a potential family therapist, I would just love to learn. And I know we've spoken about this, but I think it's amazing your approach with boundaries, treating them as more of a we versus a me mindset. So if you guys could just explain kind of your philosophy and we can just start the conversation there.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times people are learning boundaries more from that therapeutic aspect, which we do have our master's in marriage and family therapy as well. But where we saw the biggest gap in terms of how people were setting boundaries is they were coming more from that me mindset, a unilateral perspective, saying to their partner or family member, like, if you don't do this, then I'm going to do that. Well, that's more of an ultimatum rather than a boundary. And you're projecting a one-sided need onto a relationship dynamic. And more than likely, that person on the receiving end is not going to feel good or want to necessarily meet that quote unquote boundary where it's more of an ultimatum. And you're going to be met with resistance and then wonder why your boundary didn't work. And so having our background in mediation and conflict resolution, we realize that in order for boundaries really to work in relationships, you need to co-create around a shared value. And so you're negotiating two different opposing perspectives maybe, and everybody has their own belief system from their own upbringing and whatnot. So everyone, even if you have a shared value of trust, each person in that relationship might have a different variation of what that looks like within the relationship. So that's why we co-create boundaries in order to create mutual agreements from a we mindset within the relationship.
Yeah, no, I love that. And as you're 100% right, because even I will attest as a student who is learning a lot about boundaries and a potential structural marriage and family therapist, we are taught that boundaries are to protect one person in the system. They're not very mutual. But I think that's another thing too that I think is important in relationships. To define those core beliefs, to define those core values, because as you said, trust is a very um open concept. What I think is trust, what I view as trust as, you have a totally different perspective and a totally different experience with trust. And but something I did want to tell the audience and wanted you guys to go over kind of your I know you said the we mindset, but what is that from your book that, and then not high level, but they have a book, so guys, don't, we're not going to give you all the secrets, but the ASAP acronym I think is brilliant too, to how you approach boundaries. So if you guys want to go over that, I think that'd be great.
Yes, and the reason why we use the ASAP method and came up with it is because you want to set a boundary as soon as you feel like someone is violating a core need or value. Because if you wait too long, then if you approach this 2 hours or 2 days later, the other person's going to be like, huh, like, what are you talking about? I'm very confused. So it's really important to set it as soon as possible, whenever you feel that need. And so the first step is to assess. And so we want to ask discovery questions to gain clarity about why this behavior is happening. And you don't necessarily want to attack the person, but you're approaching the problem. And so it might be, can you share more about how come you slammed your phone against the table? Can you help me understand how come I didn't receive a call back last night? So you're just sort of asking questions to gain further insight and clarity as to what that behavior meant for the other person before you set the boundary.
Yeah, because if we don't assess the disconnect, then we're making an assumption of why that person may have engaged in that behavior. And if we're trying to set a boundary too early, we might set a boundary without really understanding where that person was coming from. And so assessing allows us to gain clarity and understanding. It also allows us to indirectly guide the conversation. And that person also might even apologize for the behavior prior to setting a boundary. And the next step in the ASAP method is set the boundary using a shared value that you can negotiate a mutual agreement on.
And typically, we like to also use I statements and we and try to avoid the word you because you don't necessarily want to point the finger at them. And so it's really important. We have this 3 sentence structure that allows you to really hone in on an emotion, a value, and then a shared goal that you want to achieve when it comes to setting the boundary. So you always want to end in a discovery question because you're trying to gain some kind of resolution towards a shared goal that you hope to achieve. And then the next step is to agree to a mutual plan. So this is after you've negotiated back and forth using your discovery questions, like we mentioned in step 1, SS. You're going to do that throughout step 2, and then you're agreeing to and step 3 because you're agreeing to a mutual plan. What can we agree upon that allows us to understand each other's communication styles or the way that we maybe want to show up in the relationship?
Yep, and the last step is P, which is proceed forward with the agreement. And then that allows there to be integrity with the boundary from both partners or both family members, both coworkers, whoever you're setting the boundary with.
I think it's important to note each person needs to have a voice in this discussion. That is the key component where each person can voice their value and be able to express what they see in regards to that boundary. So it works for the relationship because in order to get both people to honor that boundary and proceed forward, both have to be in agreement with whatever is going to uphold and to support that relationship dynamic.
100%. And do you think that's why because trust me, I struggle as a human being with setting boundaries. Do you think that's why it's so hard to set boundaries because we kind of have been programmed and conditioned to have this like kind of one-sided unilateral view of boundaries? Or what's your kind of your thoughts on?
I think part of the gap in setting boundaries is people have either, a lot of it can depend on your background in terms of, was conflict avoided in the home growing up? Was everything shoved under the rug? Or was it so highly conflictual, everybody's screaming and yelling that you just can't handle any more screaming and yelling in your life? And so we see those two opposing perspectives on how conflict was handled in the home growing up. So then I think people, sometimes there's a lot of fears or fear to rock the boat in the relationship or the connection because they don't know how that other person is going to be react. And I think a lot of times people are also in a very emotionally triggered state. And if we're in an emotionally triggered state, it's very hard to articulate from a very confident place and have the other person hear us what we're trying to say and how we're feeling. And our emotional triggers are actually necessary. They're actually windows into our values. So for example, if I say, I felt disrespected when the opposite, you're explaining the behavior, but the opposite need that needs to be met is the opposite of the trigger is the value of mutual respect. So our triggers tell us where we need to set the boundary. That's where our limits have been violated or crossed. But the value is where what we're asking to be met is the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely totally spot
I
on.
also think too, boundaries aren't taught necessarily in the home. They're not taught
Oh,
in
yeah.
school. So it's just like, where do we learn boundaries except through most of the time through life experience?
And
And
relationships and trial and error in relationships.
yeah, yeah. So I think, and I think too, because so people are so feeling oriented sometimes, they're fearful to be vulnerable, which is why they don't always speak up either. But whenever we learn to use our values, that became like a roadmap for us to be able to articulate what it is that we need and want without feeling unsafe or uncomfortable when it came to expressing what it is that we desired.
Yeah, and I think Jen, you touched upon a really good topic of like knowing your triggers because I know as somebody who's done a lot of work on themselves, I'm still trying to, everybody's gonna get triggered by something. We're human, you know what I mean? Like if I
Right.
would be lying if I said I was gonna go through this life untriggered the rest of my time, and like that's just unrealistic. But I think yeah, like knowing yourself and knowing forming a relationship with yourself first. I'm a big proponent of that is that you can't be in a healthy relationship with somebody else if you don't know who you are, what you stand for, your core values, your triggers, everything in between. But you guys also touched upon something that I wanted to talk about because I think there's like a negative connotation to like conflict in relationships and even conflict within yourself. But just we'll keep it with relationships for now because we're talking about relational things. But I personally don't perceive conflict as like a bad thing. I think it shows like whether the relationship is healthy or not, whether they can, whether it can maintain itself. And then I think it brings up a lot of things to light that the couple, if they're or whatever, they want to work on. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, she and I both think conflict is a very healthy tool in terms of being able to work through it in a relationship. Because if you're not able to work through your differences and one person is fearful to speak up, then you're creating these patterns or these dynamics within the relationship that are going to be unhealthy, and you're not going to be fulfilled within that connection. So in order for us to be fulfilled in our relationships, sometimes we have to bring up situations, even if it feels uneasy or uncomfortable, in order to work through it and bridge the gap in terms of the disconnect in the relationship and get back on the same page so everybody feels internally peaceful within that connection. And so conflict is a way for us to actually deepen our relationships and actually grow to the next level. So each partner feels heard and understood and at peace.
I think too, conflict can be a twofold thing. Even though there could be conflict in relationship, if we don't speak up, we create that conflict within ourselves and create this internal war. And then it's going to impact not only our mental health, but our physical health, because conflict is something that really goes deep into ourselves on a cellular level, not just even in our like own way of the way we operate and think. So I think understanding, if you stay silent, you're creating the war within you, and then you're also disrespecting yourself in a way. So getting comfortable with conflict is a way of like, how do I approach this from a constructive place versus raising my voice or getting mad or angry? Like, how do I channel that energy into something that's going to create positivity in my life?
I wholeheartedly, you actually like took the words right. I was actually going to say that prior to the statement, and then we went in the conflict, but you, Jillian, you like hit the nail on the head with, because I've actually experienced now from a personal experience having an inner conflict, because we all have that, our core selves, our inner voice. But when I'm not aligned with my core values, or if I'm dealing with a situation where I'm like, this is not aligned, like I start getting that like kind of that inner conflict, and I feel it. You feel it. It affects your nervous system. For me, it presents as probably like anxiety. For everybody, presents differently, but then as you said, it impacts my mental health. It impacts everything else because it's starting with me. And I think that personally, that's why I think also core values in, yourself and in your relationships are so important, because we were talking about our compass, right? Like I know my compass isn't pointing due north if if I get anxiety or if I'm feeling a little uncomfortable. And I'm not saying that's bad. I think,
Right.
you can grow. I think relationships and people you grow in the discomfort. But I think knowing yourself and having those core values are truly are just they're just fundamental, as we were talking about, and in how you live your life and how to define those, and how to have effective relationships, because if your compass ain't pointing north in yourself, and then you get with another person or friendship or relationship, and your compasses where are you going to go?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to help others understand that how important your core values are in terms of our compass in life is they are alignment to our inner truth. And if
Mhm.
our values, we always say choose your top 5 values to operate by on a daily basis, and your actions or behaviors should be in alignment with those values every day. And then you're in your inner truth. But if you're not meeting your values, underneath that, your emotional needs are probably not being met. So your values are also universally understood by everyone, where feelings can be confusing or perceptions that other people may not be able to understand where you're coming from as easily.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think because also too, our emotions are often coming from the ego in the way that we are feeling and thinking, where values are more logic and heart-based thinking, which allows us to farther align forward with ourselves and other people. So it actually creates a better synergy all around and brings inner peace to our life so we don't feel uneasy or discomfort.
Yeah, and I
Oh,
also think going back to the whole like, being in aligned with like our not only like our body but also mentally in terms of our values. Like people don't think twice about going to get a glass of water if they're thirsty to fulfill that need. So why would you think twice about not setting a boundary to get your needs met in that relationship? It's just as much essential to your happiness as that water is in order to quench your thirst. And
to your like emotional well-being, your mental health. I'm big on, and I'm sure to you guys as MFTs and at my internship site, we're big on impact. So if setting a boundary in a relationship or, working with somebody to set a boundary in your relationship, whatever impact what that behavior that you're trying to protect yourself from or trying to protect the relationship from is negative for your mental health, it is essential that it's like as you said, it's as important as water, it's as important as air to people. And I think that's something that we're still working on, I think, is in the mental health field and the mental health world, is that, protecting that inner peace. And I love that you brought up inner peace, because that's one of the goals of like my kind of a program that I have called Whole. Like inner peace is one of the pillars of what I want my clients to feel. And Jillian, you mentioned a great thing too that I think we should touch upon, is like feelings. Like I always say, like peace is foundational. It is, you build upon peace. Feelings are fleeting. You don't build upon feelings, because it my feelings could change on a dime. Like I always say, like if you want to make yourself, like, I look at my life, right? Like I'm like, if I want to make myself happy, like I could go to the kitchen right now and eat a dozen donuts. But will that impact, like long term? Tomorrow, I'll feel like crap about myself. I'll be like, why did I do that? I'll be going in a guilt and shame spiral, and it's not good for my health, and it impacts my general like peace. So it's like
Right.
I sometimes we have to also think in, more of those foundation, as you said, those foundational values versus acting on our feelings. Because I think as a society, and would love your thoughts on this, and just and I'll use love too, as we're taught that like love is a feeling, which yes, it is. I'm not denying that there isn't that feeling, but for me personally, love is an action. It is an ability. It is proof. It's more tangible than like, oh yeah, love is a feeling. And I think that that's where we're in an interesting point in society now, that I think people are kind of waking up to that.
I think I think we are in a very interesting place in society where I think a lot of people also internalize other people's behaviors, and they think, oh, well, what is wrong with me? Or how come this person's rejecting me or not? And they're, because a lot of with social media, I think has advanced society into a way, not necessarily a positive, but a lot of external validation and gratification is being sought, which can really shatter someone's self-worth on a regular basis if that's where we're feeding our fulfillment from through external validation. But what happens is people will take external validation from, let's say, dating or love, and or it could even be a job if they get fired or something, they internalize that as rejection. And so that provokes maybe an unresolved wound, rather than saying, was this person meeting my values? So we need to look externally and determine, was that relationship meeting my values for me to even be fulfilled? How come I'm internalizing that something's wrong with me, rather than this person may not be able to communicate with me on a consistent basis. They may not be able to show effort and show love in that connection. So our values also help us decide, is this something that whether this person can even meet my needs in that relationship?
And I think too, going back to family relationships, a lot of times people I think are fearful to speak up if there's like because of the meshment and things of that. And so it's like people get caught up in this like, no, well, family is family. So I have to do whatever family's doing or follow what family's doing. Otherwise, they're going to, you know, X completely wash me away or like X me out of the like family relationships, or you can't come to the family, holiday dinners, things like that, because like family has been so misconstrued and overused in a way that's been negative as well, which I think goes back to part of the societal norms or the external, the validations. And I think, it all goes hand in hand.
Oh, I mean, I think we all drink the same Kool-Aid when you're saying that your family of origin. And I know it sounds so cliche and everybody's like, oh, like, dang. I'm like, but it's so true. That is the first system you are brought into, and it shapes who you are. And behaviors are learned, and the values that, normally it comes from your parents, but of course as you get older they become intrinsic and you create your own, but that impacts your life so much. And talking about too, going back in our, I guess, both of our family therapy histories, like that's something that if it is a little tumultuous, like there's as you said, we were saying, Jillian, maybe like a what's the word,
Usually there's like a matriarch or someone who's
Yeah,
like
like if
over.
I'm trying to think of like no, like kind of like a we call it like a family myth or a family rule that like loyalty, for instance, is like a lovely value, you know what I mean? But when used in a way that like, maybe provokes guilt and shame for like not coming, as you said, like not coming to events, or I know some, some families like they like all want to live close to one another, and it's like maybe that's not possible for one member of the family for a number of reasons, social, economic, things. And then families create these like family myths that then unfortunately cause negative emotion within the system, which then causes mental health issues, which then causes generational trauma, and people don't realize that how deep it kind of goes. Like, and I'm not saying that, by, if you have a standard, and or if you have family rules, those aren't bad things, but but the impact of it, and the if it's provoking, as I said, mirror like negative emotion, that I think
Right.
has damage. People don't see that. They're like, they see it as like, oh, like, and I'll be maybe a perfect one is like, oh, like family comes first. Like I think that's a very like common, everybody's like, oh, family comes first, family comes first, family comes first. But like, and I'm a family person. Obviously, I have a family. I love my family, but like, I'm like, no, like you and your mental health comes first. Like airplane,
Correct.
metaphor, like airplane mask, you know what I mean? Like you got to put your air mask on before you help your family. Like love my family, but if I will be of no help to you, or can't love you, can't enjoy time with you if I'm not whole.
Right. We have to take care of ourselves first. And that comes back to personal boundaries in terms of what we need to do for ourselves every single day. I think a lot of times also another big misconception is people think, oh, I'm doing my self-care. I'm going to the gym. I'm doing this. Or I'm eating healthy meals. Well, that's how we physically take care of ourselves, where self-love actually takes a fraction of the time, like 10 minutes a day, where going to the gym or making meals might take an hour or two a day. And self-love actually has a greater impact on our mental health and how we feel. And that's more about like doing like deep breathing or journaling or meditation, whatever really works for you to really process your emotions or your feelings in what you want or different choices you might want to make for your life. Doing that is way more beneficial to our mental health on a daily basis and literally takes no more than like 5, 10
Yeah.
minutes.
And you don't have to spend any money on it.
Right.
No, it's literally at your fingertips, or in your with your body. Like, use yourself. You are your biggest tool
Mhm.
at the end of the day, which, like I said, it goes back to having that value alignment with yourself and showing up for you. If you don't show up for you, how can you
Yep.
really, well, how are other people gonna, you can't expect other people to show up for you.
Yeah,
Like,
that's just like I think a energetic exchange that's not spoken, but people will energetically be able to interpret if you're not taking care of yourself. That sets the standard as to whether they may or may not also respect or how they treat you in that dynamic too.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a big, like, the one things that I work with my clients on a lot is I always say, like, I think my three questions to them, like, at the end of the program that I work with them, I'm like, what's your most valuable asset? What's your most lucrative investment? And who is your most significant relationship with? And if that answer isn't you, we still have work to do.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm being honest with them, and I'm like, if you think your most lucrative investment is your house, like think again, like and it's a hard mental shift, especially for because of the way we think of investments and relationships. But I'm like, as you said, like Jillian, like you are your number one project. You are your number one investment, and I think too in the mental health world, there's also this like talking about self-care and self-love. I love where this conversation is going. That like self-care has to be like I said, like massages and like getting your nails done, and like it's not like self-care could be like sleeping in. Like, you know what I mean? If you're tired, like self-care is listening to, as you said, listening to your body. Like, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like self-care to me is sometimes just when I'm working all day, like just going outside for 15 minutes and, getting fresh.
great.
You know what I mean? Like it does, I feel like we have this in our society, like, oh, self-care needs to be like this, like almost like self-indulgent, like spa day. And it's like you can
No.
just micro self-care moments, throughout the day. And as you said, to maintain your mental health and to practice self-love. Like tell yourself, I was like, tell yourself you love yourself in the mirror. Like, like there's a book that I love. I forget he's really I forget his name. It's like love yourself like your life depends on it. Like that's how you should be. I mean, that's how we should be loving ourselves.
Well, and that's the thing, I think too. So in order for us to set boundaries in our relationships, it all begins with
You.
us having boundaries with ourselves as well too, because if you're not having those boundaries with yourself on a day-to-day basis, like it will be much harder, and it's going to feel like a foreign language trying to set them with other people, because it's not going to feel normal. It's not going to feel like comfortable, because like you have to start practicing what you believe in, because otherwise like it's going to be much harder to speak that language. And you can speak boundaries fluently, but it's a practice thing. It's not something that happens overnight, and it does take practice doing it. But once you do it, like your life changes. Like you feel like more
Amazing.
powerful, you feel confident, you feel like you can have any conversation, resolve any kind of conflict. Like it literally transforms every relationship around you, and it just brings, like I said, goes back to the inner peace.
Love it. No, and thank you guys both. This has been such a enlightening, refreshing conversation. And I just want to thank you both for coming on the show. And you can where can we get your book? Because I want to talk about that. Do a little plug and play for your book, because that's awesome that you guys have a book. I love it.
Yeah, you can grab our book Boundary Badass over on Amazon, or you can to janandjillian.com as well to grab our boundary scripts.
Awesome. And they also to sign up for they have you have a blog. It has wonderful information about, best setting boundaries, relationship, advice, and relational, dealing with relational issues there. And as fellow, MFTs, my heart definitely has a little, fluttering a little bit over here, because the way we're taught and the way we're is different than many other people in the field, and thinking systemically and relationally. And that's another thing that I'll just end the podcast on, is that I always ask people, like, name something you don't have a relationship with. Like, even if it's things or material things, like, there's still a relationship. Even not having a relationship with something is a relationship. So I love having, like-minded people on the show. But thank you all for listening. As always, you can find the video for this podcast on my YouTube channel, Feeling and Healing. And then the podcast is live on Apple, iTunes, and Spotify. Thanks, everybody.